Point of View Audio presents Part 5 of The Way It Has to Be, a novella written by Michael E. Hammond. It took a great amount of debate, but the next day Blair and I decided to return to the ravine. Somehow, the idea of going back in the light of day made the whole plan feel safer. I stirred up a fire in our fire ring and attempted my spell once again. I placed one hand on a stone and the other on a root, and gazed into the flames and let my mind fall away. I saw Blair standing beside me, watching intently as I performed the spell. I saw a deer and birds and a few squirrels squabbling over a nut. I let my mind drift across the forest, returning to the ravine as well as other corners of the woods, and I felt no sign of the cultists we'd seen the night before. I let go of the root and the stone, and my mind came rushing back to camp.
"Well,"
Blair asked,
"did you see anything?"
"I saw you," I said, feeling a little disoriented. "I saw animals playing, the usual stuff. No sign of the cultists."
"Good,"
he said.
"Let's go check the place out before they decide to come back."
We made our way to the ravine along a small footpath in the low-lying lands of the valley. Something about the place felt quiet. The sounds of the birds singing had almost ceased, the wind passing through the leaves above dying down to almost nothing. All other forest sounds seemed insulated by the shelter of the steep hills that climbed up high above us. Soon we stumbled upon the great fire pit. The leaves around it had been trampled into the dirt. A faint, bluish-white smoke still smoldered from the ashes. To our surprise, we noticed what looked like goat skulls tied to the trunks of the surrounding trees. Each one had been painted black, their curling horns painted a deep crimson red. As we examined them further, we noticed that they were all situated to look directly at the fire pit.
That's not creepy at all,"
Blair said, shaking his head. None of it felt right. The unearthly quiet of the valley, the black goat skulls affixed to the trees, their hollow eyes seeming to look right at me. There was a presence in that ravine that I couldn't quite shake away. I wasn't sure if it was my imagination or if something was truly wrong with the place. We continued to walk along the footpath that had been stamped into the ground, leading us closer and closer to the old cottage. Blair and I both felt like there was something important inside, some clue as to what those cultists were up to. As we approached, we could see the place in greater detail. It was a small house, looking more the size of a cabin than an actual house. It had a slanted, asymmetrical peaked roof that was covered in thick, rich green moss. The outer walls were sun-bleached, cracked, and weathered by time. A few small, square windows had been busted out, sharp, jagged glass sticking out of the blackness from within. A few tiny steps led up to what could hardly be considered a porch. It was more a roofed platform big enough to shelter the house's windowless door. Had it not been for the set of black goat skulls affixed to the beams of the porch, it might actually look somewhat quaint and peaceful. We stood before the doorway, our curiosity compelling us forward. Without so much a word, we crept up the creaky stairs. I tried my best to ignore the goat skulls, but still, I couldn't shake the feeling of wrongness that all of this seemed to hold. Before I knew it, we were inside. It looked much like you would expect an old abandoned house to look. There was peeling wallpaper, chipped paint, cracked ceilings. Dirt coated the floor, and despite the broken windows, the air inside was stuffy and stagnant. We wandered the tiny house looking for anything that stood out, but nothing seemed out of place. Everything about it seemed empty and forgotten. We then found an indescript wooden door. I turned the knob and swung the door open, revealing a stairway downward into the blackness below. As soon as I saw it, I knew I did not want to venture into the basement. The idea of traveling underfoot in this formidable place made me feel like we were cornering ourselves in, with no chance of escape should we need to. Blair, on the other hand, was bound and determined that we go down there, just to see what we might find. The next thing I knew, we were descending the rickety old stairs into the cold, musty air of the dark basement. That is where we found the book. Light spilled in through a tiny window in the foundation, granting just enough light to see. There was a few shelves lining the walls, dusty and covered with cobwebs. Where the light trickled in, I saw the distinct shape of a book sitting temptingly on the shelf. It was black, bound in leather like some kind of journal. Metal clasps were riveted to the corners, adding just an extra bit of flair. We opened to the first page, and in beautiful calligraphy was written, Book of the Shadow, property of Medora M.
"What is this?"
Blair said, excitement thick in his voice. Book of the Shadow, I read aloud.
"What do you think it is?"
he asked. Well, I said, witches would often write their spells in something called a Book of Shadows. I know it sounds a little ominous, but remember that witches never actually practiced what we would consider black magic, only earth magic. You see, the term Book of Shadows comes from a time when witches were persecuted. To stay safe, they would meet in the shadows, otherwise meaning secret, to practice their craft.
"Ah," he mumbled, "that makes sense."
This is likely a book of spells written by a witch named Medora M., I said, whoever that might be.
"Well, we came here to check the place out, and I'd say we did just that," Blair said, stuffing the book into his bag. "Now, let's get the hell out of here."
What are you doing with that? I asked, not comfortable with the idea of taking the book. Maybe we should just look through it here and leave it be.
"The longer we sit here, the likelier we are to get caught by those cultists," he said. "This book here could be full of spells we can learn to practice, stuff we won't be able to find anywhere else. I doubt that this Medora M will even notice it missing."
What makes you think so? I asked.
"There's a stack of 'em,"
he said, pointing to another shelf, filled with more books that looked just like it.
"If you want to stay here and read through it, by all means, go ahead. I'm taking this one and getting as far away from this place as possible."
I didn't have time to argue with him, so I didn't even bother. We made our way up the stairs, out of the house and out of the valley with the black goat skulls, cultists, and unnatural fires, hoping to put the idea of it all far behind me. Back in the comfort of our campsite, I felt the ease settling back over me for the first time since the night before. I was lying on my back watching the trees overhead sway peacefully in the breeze, a nice warm fire crackling next to me in the ring of stones. The birds were singing again, and a soft, warm breeze fluttered over me, making things feel almost perfect. I looked over and saw Blair studying the book we'd found. His mind seemed so fixated on the information he was reading that I doubted anything could have stirred him from his concentration. He was drawn to the words on the page with an intensity that I had seen numerous times. It reminded me of when we first got the books from Miss Wayworth's shop. I smiled softly to myself. Things were finally getting back to normal. As long as this book made him happy, then I was happy too. I was just about to doze off when Blair startled me back to reality.
"This book is filled with some pretty fascinating stuff," he said, tapping me on the shoulder. "This Medora M started out as a herbologist, studying the medicinal and magical properties of plants in this very woods. There are some herbs we could actually brew into some teas just around this campsite."
"Oh, yeah?" I said with a sleepy smile.
"She has many brews listed here," he said, flipping through the pages. "Not only that, but she's got some interesting spells she discovered while out here. Some for communing with animals, some for making herbs and plants grow before your eyes. She talks about tapping into things out here she never thought possible."
"Like what?" I asked.
"Not sure," he replied, flipping a few more pages. "After a while, she talks about tapping into a forest power that expanded her understanding of many things. She has a bunch of spells written in languages I don't understand, and she has some drawings and symbols here I don't really get either."
"Well," I joked, "as long as we aren't sacrificing animals or something, I'd say we're okay." He flipped back a few pages and began to skim the text, his eyes intent on what he was reading.
"Here we go," he said after a long pause. "This one seems right up our alley. It falls in the line of fire spells."
"What does it say?" I asked, sitting up from my bed on the soft ground.
"I'm not totally sure," he said. Some of it's written in Latin or something, but the gist of it has to do with seeking knowledge through the flame. Maybe it's similar to your little trick of exploring the forest with your mind.
I looked over the page. It was written in an odd language with a few notes I could understand. There was a crude drawing of a fire ring, flames, and a woman's face with eyes closed. There was a drawing above the woman's face that reminded me of a thought bubble in a comic book. Inside the little bubble was a drawing of what looked like a person floating above the trees. My overall impression of the drawing seemed in line with what Blair had thought, using the flames to explore with one's mind. "I think you're right," I said. "I just wish I knew what these words meant."
"It's not about sacrificing animals," Blair said with a smile, stretching across his lips. "And ye harm none, do as ye will."
"How did I know you were going to say that?" I surrendered with a sigh. "Let's give it a go." We stood on the opposite sides of the fire ring, facing one another like we did so many times before. After studying the strange incantation to the point of memory, we joined hands. He gazed into my eyes and I into his, and he gave me a little nod, and the slightest hint of a smile. That is when we began to recite those strange words. Imatan Demesha Tisiertop Siet Kalab Emalf Ima Edemer Siet Engarf Nietem Kalab Emalf. As we spoke the words that neither of us could understand, we stared into those flames between us with what I can only describe as a burning intensity. Over and over we spoke them until it sounded less like clumsy words that we were practically stumbling over to a full-on chant in unison. Soon I could feel them moving through me as if I was speaking them without even trying. That is when the fire began to change. They were no longer that orangey, yellowish red they had always been. They grew darker and darker, turning colors the fire just should not turn. It was at this point when I could feel the immense power growing inside me. It was as if pains I didn't know I had were suddenly gone, euphoric pleasure crashing over me in waves. As the fire grew darker and darker, this feeling of power inside me grew with it. I was losing control. It was as if something inside me was rearranging, changing me forever. The flames grew darker until at last they went from a dark blue to a deep, beautiful violet, then to a haunting shade of impossible black. As I gazed into that dark fire, I noticed that it no longer put out any light at all. It was flickering and dancing like fire. It even held the shape of fire, but it was an impenetrable black with just the faintest hint of a purple highlighting the edges. I felt stronger than I had ever felt before, the heat of that dark fire filling me, changing me. Then I felt as if I was being violated by some unseen and unnatural force. Visions began to fill my mind. Visions of a black goat enshrouded by darkness, a mass of tentacle-like tendrils flailing in the void around it. It simply stared at me, its unnatural eyes silently beckoning me to follow. The fire began to burn me as I resisted the thrall of that goat-like beast. I reeled back, pulling away, letting go of Blair's hands in the process. Losing my bearings of where I was even at that point, I stumbled and fell flat on my ass.
"What the hell?"
Blair said, his eyes burning with an anger.
"Why did you let go?"
"The fire burned me," I said in shock. "I don't know what all that was, but it wasn't right."
"It burnt you because you failed to embrace the black flame," he said darkly. "And I don't know what you're talking about, Benjamin. Nothing has ever felt so right."
He smiled a wicked smile and held out his hand.
"Come on, man. Let's do it again."
"No," I smacked his hand away. "That wasn't right." Frustration was burning in his eyes as he shook his head.
"You're just weak," he said. I don't know what I ever saw in you."
The words hurt. They hurt me more than I could ever care to admit. As quickly as it came, that fire of anger growing in his eyes faded, replaced by a look of confusion. He looked at his hands and then me sitting on the ground.
I'm sorry," he said. "I don't know what came over me."
He knelt down and wrapped his arms around me, then kissed me softly.
"You're right," he said. "Something about that spell was wrong."
There was a sincere look of shame in his eyes as he began to pull away. I truly believed he had no idea what was happening. I grabbed his hand and didn't let him go, pulling him onto the ground on top of me. I kissed him, pushing the thought of that black flame far from my mind. He kissed me back, his usual smile returning to his lips. "Think nothing of it," I said. "Let's just not do that again." I reached for the black book, still open on the ground beside me, giving the tiny glance before slamming it shut. "All that we need," I said with a smile, "is just you and me."
"I agree,"
he said, bending down for another kiss. I didn't tell him then how I felt changed by the black flame, and he didn't say it either, but I think we both knew. I just wanted to surrender into that moment and forget about it all. I didn't even tell him about my vision of that black goat-like thing in the dark. He probably wouldn't have believed me even if I had. After that day, Blair was never quite the same again. Neither of us were quite the same, really, but there was something truly off about him. Don't get me wrong, there were days where things were perfectly normal. Perfect, even, but other days it was as if he was someone else. His mind would seem to slip away from him, and he'd be taken by sudden bouts of extreme guilt or bursts of unexplainable anger. Despite my objections, he still held onto the black book. He even practiced magic from the accursed thing. He'd often tell me that one spell was not enough to condemn the book as a whole. He was convinced that there was still so much useful knowledge in that book to offer us, to help us grow and hone our powers. I just didn't agree. Now and again he'd find some spell in the old book he'd want to try and insist that I join him. When I would refuse, he would demand that I do it. When I continued to refuse, he'd grow incredibly angry, yell at me, and sometimes even show signs of violence, though as quickly as these outbursts would come on, he would return to his normal self and assure me that he had no idea what had come over him. This was not the Blair that I had known. It was as if something had taken control of him, and I was beginning to understand what that was. A few weeks had passed in a roller coaster of emotions. We had good days, we'd fight, we'd make up, we'd make love, only to do it all over again. One particular day I was staying at his house again, and things seemed to be going rather well. We snuck off into the woods to have a little fun together. Afterwards, we started a little fire in our firing, and we were enjoying the simple tranquillities that the woods often offered. Blair was kissing my neck, and I was preparing for round number 2, when he whispered into my ear.
"We've grown so much over the past several weeks,"
he said, biting at my flesh.
"We're stronger now, closer now. Imagine how much closer we could be, could feel. All we need to do is to control it. I think we can now."
"Control what?" I asked.
"The black flame," he said. "It's power, poetry. It's part of us now."
"What are you talking about?" I asked, pushing myself away.
"I know you feel it," he said. "You feel it burning in your soul, just as I do. We need only reach out and embrace it, control it. It's the way it has to be."
"No, it's not," I said. "That magic is messing with your brain. There's nothing good about it. I think we should take that book back and be done with it."
"No!"
he shouted at me, hate beaming in his shimmering emerald eyes.
"The book is mine. You're just afraid."
"Damn right I am," I said, "and you should be too. I feel like I don't even know you anymore."
"I feel the same way,"
he said coldly, towering over me.
"You mean nothing to me, Ben. You're just a scared, pathetic waste of space."
"A pathetic waste of space, huh?" I growled. "You were the one who wanted to fuck me first, but all you did was fuck me over." That's when he hit me. He lunged forward, punching me square in the stomach. I wasn't sure if it was from the sheer force of his blow or if it was the shock that actually hit me, but I could hardly breathe. My eyes were welling with tears as I looked at this man I cared so much for. "See what you're doing?" I said, cradling my stomach. There was a flash in his eyes, and he looked like himself again. I could see the guilt of what he'd done inching across his expression, and he reached his hands out for mine. I pushed it away. "No," I said. "It's either the book or it's me. You've clearly made your choice." Without so much a glance, I turned and walked away. I could hear his hushed and muffled sobs as I made my way through the trees and away from our campsite. But I didn't care. I didn't even cry as I walked out of those woods, through the pasture, back to the house. I felt only the pity, the terror, and the waste of it all. Thoughts filled my head of the night we'd met and all the fun we'd had, conversations, the closeness we shared. Was it all really over? I could not begin to understand what he was going through. I knew only that he had changed. Blair Everett was no longer the friend he used to be. He was no longer the man he used to be. He had chosen his love of this magic over the love of me. And why? Because of an obsession with an accursed black flame spell? I shuddered at the thought. Mrs. Madison said something that stirred me from my thoughts. I asked. I'd been so caught up in my rambling that I hadn't even heard what she said. "What do you suppose was the significance of that black goat?" she repeated, seeming rather intrigued by such an idea. "I have no idea, to tell you the truth," I said. "It was just one of those unexplainable mysteries." She mumbled. We walked through the remains of the frozen ravine. Even without the trees and without those black goat skulls staring at me with those hollow eyes, it still felt unsettlingly quiet. No birds, no wind, no sound but our own muffled footsteps crunching in the frosty ground. No other sound around me save but Mrs. Madison, and I could feel that haunting, unnatural presence even more now than ever. "Did you ever patch things up with the Everett boy?" she asked. "I'm getting to that," I said with an empty smile. "We may be here now, but my story isn't over just yet." 3 days had passed, and I heard nothing from Blair. Not a single word. It was the longest we'd gone without talking, and as much as I hated to admit it, I wished I didn't, but I missed him. I wanted to talk to him. I wanted to see how he was doing, but he was locked in a world of his own, beyond my control, changed and changing from this obsession with the strange, dark flame. None of it made any sense to me. It's true, I felt changed by the dark fire myself, but it only made me more cautious and more aware of the magics around me. For him, he seemed to embrace it, as if he didn't see the strange darkness behind it. I knew I had to come to a decision. I had to figure out what was going on with Blair and our friendship, but I was no expert when it came to such things. What was I supposed to do? An idea came to me almost at once. I knew what I had to do. I knew where I had to go. There was only one person I could think of who might know what was going on, and it was a long shot. I just prayed that this person could actually help me. I found myself once again standing before a brick house, a sign nestled into the lush green ivy that read, "The Nightingale." I was rehearsing in my mind what to even say, but it all sounded so ridiculous. I turned the knob and was greeted again by the clang of the shop bell hanging above the door. The shop was once again empty, fragrant with the scent of incense lingering in the air, some soft ambient piano music playing in the background. Almost immediately I heard the clattering of beads, and I saw Miss Wayworth come through the door behind the counter. She was just as beautiful as I remembered, her dark hair spilling over her bare shoulders. She was wearing a blue, flowy, off-the-shoulder blouse that reminded me of a gypsy. That crescent moon necklace was still cradled in her bosom. "Can I help you?" she asked in her classy English accent, her almond-shaped eyes gazing up from her book to look at me. "Oh, I remember you. Where is your other half, love, or did you leave him behind today?" "Other half?" I asked. "The young man who accompanied you. No need to hide it." She waved her hand dismissively. "I could tell the moment you walked in here how you felt about each other. I'm very empathic, after all." "Well," I said, "he's kind of the reason I'm here." "Oh?" she said, her brow lifted, her gaze intensified. She closed the book and sat down on the counter, giving me her full attention. "Well," I said, not sure how I wanted to phrase it, "I think something's happened to him as a result of magic." "Not the magic you learned from any of the books you got from here," she growled, her eyes sharp. "You must be mistaken, love. I don't sell dangerous magics here." No, I wasn't saying that at all," I said. "It was from another book, One we found somewhere else. I just don't get it. We found a book of shadows written by some witch. It was all fine until we tried a spell that made the fire turn black. Black, you say? She asked, putting a finger elegantly to her chin. This doesn't sound like the work of a simple witch. Tell me, where did you find this book? In the basement of an old abandoned house, I said. Blair and I found it out in the woods while we were camping. We saw what looked like cultists performing the spell. The next day, Blair insisted that we go check the place out. That's where we found the book. It was a book of shadows, you say? She asked. Are you quite certain of this? I'm almost positive, I said. It was black, kind of like a journal, titled Book of the Shadow. Book of the Shadow? She gasped, as if it conjured up some long-forgotten memory. Can you tell me anything else about this book that could give me any insight to where it might have come from? Well, I said, all I can really say is that it was the property of someone called Medora M. Some of it was written in a language I didn't understand. Oh, she mumbled as if taken aback. She put a hand to her mouth as if thinking. I could sense that it was bad news. I hate to tell you this, love, but what you found was not a book of shadows. I fear that it was something far worse. Worse? I asked. How so? What you found was something titled Book of the Shadow, emphasis on the, she said. This Medora M. was no witch, not in the sense that you and I are, anyway. She was a sorceress, one who was rumored to have uncovered something truly dark. What do you mean? I asked. I can really say no more, she said, until I see the book for myself, that is. That would be a task far easier said than done. I had no idea how I was supposed to get the book away from Blair, and I doubted he would even talk to me at that point, much less hand the book over. I wondered if I could sneak into his house and steal it. Probably not. Even if I could manage to get away with it, he would know it was me. He had already punched me once in a fit of anger, and if this book was something truly dark, I shuddered to think what he might have done to me with this new knowledge. I was just about to give up hope when it all became so clear to me. I knew exactly how I could get Leona Wayworth to see this book. Blair wouldn't interfere. In fact, Blair wouldn't even know. This has been Part 5 of the audio recording of The Way It Has to Be. If you have enjoyed what you've heard so far, please consider liking, subscribing, and even commenting, as the story will soon continue in Part 6.